afternoon. My name is Mark Richardson. I am the project lead at Bancor. For those who aren't familiar with us, we're a very old project now, slightly older than Ethereum. We invented something called the automatic market maker, or AMM for short. This was originally developed as a technology anticipated for use on Bitcoin's smart contract infrastructure back when colored coins and Mastercoin and things was happening. And then when the Bitcoin community failed to adopt that, Ethereum was kind of started as a protest. And we ended up launching our technology there instead. So today we're going to be talking about fixed point approximations in exchange algorithms. This is largely inspired by the fact that we're very proud to have DNA now as a partner who is deploying our most recent exchange protocol, Carbon DeFi, on the BNB chain as a starting point, and hopefully a lot more blockchains thereafter. Okay, so in general, I find that when people are speaking about their Web3 products, decentralized exchanges in particular, there's a sort of a flow to at least what the development process is looking like, and then how they articulate what their project is and what it does. So, from a development perspective, obviously figuring out what you want to do first makes a lot of sense. And then after you kind of have that target in mind, there's the laborious process of defining it, usually mathematically. And this is in precise, usually algebraic mathematics. And I consider this a research task. And then after that begins the more difficult stuff that people rarely talk about. So, for example, after you get from a purely abstract model and need to develop it now in a smart contract context, you're always developing an approximation of the system that you've just invented, never the actual invention itself. And then after you have that description, you then have to actually implement it. And these are both engineering tasks. And most of the time, people are going to be talking about these first two steps because they're the most, blue sky. They're generally the most friendly and the most exciting. And people don't spend a lot of time talking about how they made these decisions. And I think that this is frightening because usually this is where the overwhelming majority of mistakes in the industry are made. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that failing to present to people who are going to use these products how these decisions were made might be, let's say, misconstrued as sweeping something under the rug that's going to be exploited later. And we don't have any shortage of recent examples that we can point at. And I'm going to redact some of these projects, although these were very high profile exploits, so you already know what they are, I assume. So please, I think that this is a rare talk. You're not going to get this almost anywhere else. So just recently, I pulled this from Twitter as I was preparing these slides. There was a very old, very well-known decentralized exchange that was exploited for about $110 million. And I want to point out that one of the critiques that this particular Twitter user has brought is that audited by such and such doesn't really mean anything anymore. And they're right. I'm not sure that it meant anything in the first place. The people that understand your product and the design decisions and engineering decisions that you made is really something you have to, I guess, shoulder yourself. And it's naive, I would say dangerously naive, to assume that an auditor over 3 weeks is going to be able to perfectly understand that system. This is, again, referring to the same exploit. And I've underlined here that this is a precision and rounding issue. And this is something that is going to become the theme of the presentation that you're about to see, because I'm going to show you how we control these variables and avoid these kinds of exploit vectors. Now, this was, this is the summary of this particular exploit, where the attacker exploited a rounding down precision error and then managed to manipulate prices and, carefully constructed transactions to make the protocol do something that it wasn't designed to do. But I think that is an oversimplification. The protocol was designed to be exploited this way, right? That's what it means. If you haven't controlled your rounding errors precisely enough, then maybe leaning a little bit too hard into that coder's law mentality, You cannot really accuse someone else of misusing your protocol. Really, what they did was discover a mistake that you had made. And the ethics of it is not necessarily what I'm discussing here, but just saying that it's really important that we bring attention to these kinds of things. This is a completely different exchange now. This is going back September. This was another fairly high profile $8.4 million exploit that again drained all of the funds of this exchange and actually led to the insolvency of that team. And now that exchange is no more. That business is effectively dead. And again, under analysis, that particular exploit was a precision loss error. Okay, so there is a theme here. And these are just two examples from the last 3 months, from the last 2 months. If you go back in DeFi's history, you'll find that, a very, very large proportion of the smart contract vulnerabilities are discovered because people haven't paid very close attention to their engineering responsibilities. And so I would like to allay the suspicion that you might have that we don't take these things seriously. And I'm going to do that by showing you exactly what we do. So first, let's talk product. This is an animation for what a typical AMM exchange would look like. And it's difficult to see on this particular screen, but there's a sort of green shaded area here that's depicting the bidding liquidity that exchange is offering. And the red region here is depicting the asking liquidity. And then this is the canonical constant product bonding curve that we released back in 2016. And what I want you to see here is that we've got effectively just a model price chart here, which is just a sort of sinusoidal shape. And we're tracking the profits versus losses for this particular system. And you can see that the drawdown is relatively severe. So this is a 5.5% drawdown. And at its peak, you can see it's barely breaking above break even. So AMMs typically aren't really considered great financial vehicles. Although if you're a taker in a blockchain ecosystem, it's nice to have that kind of liquidity available all the time. But as a market maker, they really don't represent anything that is of, any business interest. Concentrated liquidity is something that Bancor released in 2020. And it is similar in the sense that it offers bidding and asking liquidity either side of a particular range, but now it constrains the liquidity that's available to between two price bounds. Bancor was the first to market with this, but Uniswap v3 is now the canonical version of it, but it's the same idea. Now, what I want you to see here is that I'm using exactly the same price curve. And the asking and bidding liquidity is being converted, through market interaction the same way that it usually would. But now our drawdown is much higher, right? So this is a 25% drawdown. And again, just barely breaking above even at the top. And the reason for this is because you are effectively levering your liquidity up around the price bounds that you're contributing to, which means that in general, the losses on concentrated liquidity systems are like 5 to 6x greater than they would be on a conventional AMM. In the system that we're building, what we do is we essentially allow the person who is making this market to choose where the bidding and asking liquidity bands lie separately. Right, so there is no prescription that as the bidding liquidity is being taken, that necessarily the asking liquidity has to appear immediately behind it. And this means that sophisticated market makers like DNA are able to create custom markets with custom spreads and interact with them with the on-chain liquidity in a way that is, let's say, more aligned with their specific risk posture. And if we track the profits versus losses on the graph over here, you can see already the financial performance is much higher than either of those two models. And the reason is relatively easy to explain, and that's that it's effectively always waiting for better prices to buy and higher prices to sell. So now that you're no longer restricted to how the asking and bidding prices are going to be determined as a function of each other, we now allow the maker to express whatever it is that they want those prices to be. So it's a much more flexible system, and much more aligned with selfish financial selfish financial priorities. So that's how the product works. How do we achieve it? Okay, if you haven't seen this shape before, this is the sort of canonical concentrated bonding curve. It can take lots of different shapes, different sizes, and I've spent a lot of time discussing the theory that determines how this thing works in my previous lectures. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but just know that there is a very specific algebraic description for this thing, and you can express it in lots of different ways. So the specific parameter choices that you use to describe this thing is irrelevant. There is one mathematical object behind all of it, and all of the engineering decisions that we're talking about today are going to be exclusive to this particular parameterization rather than the other two, but they are all different algebraic rearrangements of the same idea. If you want to have a look at where this theory comes from and study it yourself, I do have a paper up on the archive called DeFi's Concentrated Liquidity from Scratch, where I derive all of these formulas from first principles so that I don't have to go through them with you in this lecture today. I do have a 5-part lecture series on YouTube that I made for the Token Engineering Academy, and also have previously gone through the details of these things at conferences like ETH4, or if you would like to explore that further. So that's the abstraction part. This is usually where people's presentations will end, right? Where they show you what their product is, they talk a little bit about the mathematics and kind of wash their hands of it. What we're going to do now is start looking at the actual challenges of making these things operate. So one of the things you have to realize about a computer system, and especially a computer system like a blockchain, is things like everything has to be an integer or be representable as an integer. Memory is extremely limited and you have to pay a lot for it. Rounding is unavoidable, and this is where those exploit vectors come into sharp focus, and that the scope is necessarily going to be limited by the decisions that you make on how to control these first 3 items. Okay. Now, when you're considering the exploit vector, there's really 2 different things that you need to be concerned about. The first one is that you have your market maker over here, someone like DNA using their own protocol now, that if they are interacting with something like the SDK or another API that's servicing the smart contracts, they will be providing, for example, these particular variables, and that's going to need to be encoded into the smart contract. Now, these can be provided with, for example, infinite precision, right? With certainly much greater precision than the contractors are going to be able to process. And so this particular processing step is one of the first things that we need to start focusing on. And then second to that is when a taker comes into the system and then interacts with the smart contract that contains the smart contract variables that have been processed this way. So there's really 2 points that we need to analyze. And we're going to be going over both of these today. Okay, so this is a slightly older ETH chart. I think this comes back to September. And it's an old version of the interface that I want you to see kind of what the interface looks like, because this is how users are going to be sort of interacting with a system like this. So you can see that, this was the price of ETH versus USDC. And someone might be looking at the way that this chart is evolving and decide that they're going to be bidding on ETH in this range and selling ETH in this range if they expect this channel to be respected for a little while longer, for example. But they don't necessarily have to represent it that way, and we're going to come back to that in just one moment. This is an example of what the encoding would look like from that particular strategy. And so you can see here, this is all like in Python in this case, but this could be a JSON file. And I've put sort of arbitrary precision in these digits. That's so slow. Okay, now there is a ambiguity here when it comes to representing this information on the smart contracts. And this is because the prices are necessarily invertible. Because we don't have any prescription as to what the numerary is, right? We assume that it's going to be something like USDC. And if it's versus a volatile asset like ETH, then that makes sense. But recognize that this could be USDC versus USDT, or USDT versus USDC, right? Or ETH versus Bitcoin, or Bitcoin versus ETH. And depending on which camp you belong to, you might disagree on what the right numeraire is going to be. So to make that point clear, imagine that a user is now choosing to swap the quote and base token assignments. So instead of buying ETH with USDC, they're now buying USDC with ETH. This is the exact same price chart. It looks a little different, but it's actually got exactly the same information in it. And I can show you with the little marker up here in the top left of the screen, right? This is the first numeraire we're looking at, and then again, flipping it upside down one more time, we can see we've got the reverse numeraire, right? The double trough here is the same as the double peak that we had on the previous slide. Now, when we take that same encoding at face value, you see that you're getting very, very different numbers now, because the price of USDC in terms of ETH is very different than measuring the price of ETH in terms of USDC. But that shouldn't be the case, right? If these two things are depicting the same object, then the way that you package it up and express it on the blockchain should be agnostic to what the numeraire token was chosen to be. So if these two inputs represent exactly the same thing, then we don't want to waste time and storage on semantics. Then after we package them up, they should represent exactly the same object. You shouldn't be able to tell these two things apart. And this is one of the mistakes that was made in one of the hacks that happened just recently, where the system itself expressed a preferred numeraire, and that meant that the whole system was constantly preferring a direction of rounding that made it possible for the attacker to exploit it. Whereas if we decompose this into a single object that doesn't know about the numeraire, then the rounding becomes easier to control, and I'm going to show you how we do that. This is just general advice. If you're reading a white paper, that's fine. But then if you then move on to someone's technical documents and it feels like white paper version 2, that project has made a dramatic mistake in how they're conveying the technical details of how their protocol works. We have a very simple convention here, where we basically just list out the two token addresses that are associated with the strategy that is being deployed, where each one of these tokens is effectively its own numeraire in its own context. So what we have here is these variable names, and I'm going to come back to exactly how to interpret these in a moment. But each one of them expresses the price of the token that corresponds to that order. So if token 0, for example, is Ethereum, then the order 0 component of the smart contract will refer to an Ethereum balance and then 3 variables that tell you about its price. Now, the reason why this convention makes sense is that notice that we have y coordinates on both. Prices are usually expressed in terms of something like dy dx, right? And so by deliberately labeling both of these token balances as a y coordinate, then the price structure for both of these things, I think, follows naturally from the convention that we've set up. Now, this is not, I think, trivial. In some smart contracts, you will see someone label these as maybe X and Y, or they'll just choose some other parameter name. But I think in this case, for someone who is naive and approaching the smart contract for the first time, it's more intuitive what the encoding of the smart contracts actually means. Now, this is an example encoding. This is, again, just dummy data, but I wanted to show you exactly what this looks like, right? So for the ID of the particular strategy at the top, followed by exactly the structure that I showed you on the slide before. Now, these variables here are representing the price of ETH in USDC, right? So, the reciprocal price, ETH per USDC, because token 0 happens to be the Ethereum token. Whereas if we have a look at the token 1 address, which happens to be USDC here, then we know that this price is in units of USDC per ETH. I think that this convention is helpful. I think it's intuitive. And I think that this can stop users inflicting self-harm on themselves. Respect the EVM. We're now going to have to talk about finite memory and the kinds of challenges that brings with it. We have effectively 3 slots in memory. Each one of these slots contains about 128 bits that we have access to. And we organize it this way. So we have effectively 2 slots in memory associated to exclusively price data. And then we use 1 slot to store the token balance data that's going to effectively enumerate how far we are through the price range. Now you can see down here, this is previewing one of the compression methods that we use to bring meaning to A and B in a really helpful way. And I think in a really clever way that makes the scope of the protocol sufficiently large to encompass a whole bunch of different trading use cases. So let's run through this step by step. Let's say that we are back in September and we are setting up this particular strategy on Ethereum. If we have a look just at that price data, one of the things that we immediately need to recognize is that if our numeraire is USDC, and that's being quoted versus ETH, then we need to take the reciprocal of those ETH prices. So that $4,803 becomes 1 over that amount. And then over here, we need to make sure that we process the decimals correctly for each one of these tokens, ETH being an 18 decimal token and USDC being a 6 decimal token. We have to do the same thing for the 4,628, which comes out to this number. And you'll note that I'm actually making explicit that these are ETH way units versus USDC way units and so on. So after we've processed all of this data from the front end, right, because this is still in arbitrary precision, we then need to think about how this is going to get packed down into the smart contracts. Now we use 2 variable names here, P high and P low, or P A and P B in the theory, that I think is again a relatively easy way to depict the information, because one of these refers to the gradient at the y-intercept of this curve, and one refers to the gradient at the x-intercept. Now, I'm not going to dive into the mathematics for this. Again, I've shown you that I've published this stuff before, and so you can explore this at your leisure. But just know that every single part of what the system does has a closed form representation, which is, again, very important, making sure that you're not opening yourself up to exploit. Whereas if you're using something like a Newton-Raphson method, these things can introduce uncertainty or undefined behavior that attackers are very, very good at exploiting. So everything that we do is always in closed form all the time. Okay, so let's have a look at these numbers now. That's square root P high is, again, that inverted price flipped back into wave system that we were looking at before. This time just raised to the power of a half to take the square root. Now that number comes out to be this, and we now have units of square root ETH way per USDC on the top, and square root USDC way per versus ETH on the bottom. Now, one of the things that's really nice about taking the square root of something is it gets much smaller, right? So over here we were taking a price of about 208 million, but after taking the square root, it's already down to about 14,000, which is very helpful because the number that we need to store in the smart contract is significantly smaller. Okay, now based on the algebra that I showed you on that last slide, you would have seen that actually we don't use the square roots of these things directly, but actually we only store the difference of the square roots as one of the smart contract variables that we call A, and then the square root of the other one is B. So we actually do some pre-processing. This is at the front end level while we're still in off-chain, which means that we can do this with very, very high levels of precision, arbitrary precision, if you like. Now, remember what I said about 10 slides ago is that everything is an integer. And we've got an issue here because based on the price data that the user has provided in this particular case, we're already at something like 10 to the negative 6 and 10 to the negative 5. And Ethereum doesn't understand the difference between, a third and 0. Everything is always going to be rounding down to 0. So we need to find a way to deal with this. That also handle the precision error that we've encountered elsewhere in these other steps. So one of the strategies that we employ is a scaling constant. So whenever we take one of these variables, so the lowercase a, we transform it into the uppercase version by multiplying it by a very large constant. In this case, 2 to the power of 48, or about 281, is that quadrillion? Which means that these very small numbers become much bigger numbers by default. Now that means that you are going to have to go back and retrofit some of the mathematics to make this work, but that's not too much of an issue. So you can see that those small numbers that we had before are now picking up, a healthy amount of significant digits in front of the decimal point, which means that a lot of the precision is going to be preserved at the time that we encode them on the smart contracts. Okay, retrofitting the mathematics with the scaling model isn't so hard. It's really just a substitution problem, and I'm not going to bother walking you through exactly how we do that, but just know that in terms of the convention, whenever I'm using the uppercase letters here, it's always the scaled up versions of these numbers. Okay, so after we've scaled up these numbers, we now need to think about how we're going to store these in the smart contract, because this is a lot of information that we're going to have to employ in a system that's not built to store a huge amount of information, really. And so I'm going to bring your attention back to this exponent and mantissa notation that I introduced before, and really elaborate on exactly what's happening here, because this is where the most of the rounding error occurs. And so it's important to understand exactly how challenging this is. We have 54 bits to work with, right? You have 6 bits for the exponent and only 48 bits for the mantissa. So consider this number for just a moment, right? This is all in decimal notation. And so if we convert it into binary, which is how it's going to look in the smart contracts, you can see where the overflow actually begins. And this is, I think, a relatively, vanilla system, right? USDC versus ETH has got to be one of the most common trading pairs anywhere on any blockchain. But we're already 3 digits over on one of these important price parameters, and more than that on the other. Now, you'd think that this would be, a relatively bad offender, but there's a much worse one, which is the Shiba Inu token. I'm not sure if anyone in this room has traded Shiba Inu before, but it's a relatively worthless, very high decimals token. And so if we compare it to something like wrapped Bitcoin, you can see that the prices are already expressed in terms of billions of tokens, right? So if you're trading Shiba Inu for a Bitcoin, the price that you would quote is about 9 billion something Shiba Inu per Bitcoin. Now, you'd think that that would be bad enough, but actually, because of the decimality difference between wrapped Bitcoin, which is an 8 decimal token, and Shiba Inu, which is an 18 decimal token, it's actually that times 10 to the 10. So it's 10 orders of magnitude worse than that. That means that we're getting truly enormous numbers down here. So for that particular schedule that I showed you on the slide before, this one right here, we're already looking at numbers that are over 2 septillion, which is much larger than anything should be stored in a smart contract. And on the other side of that, for the Bitcoin side, we're only getting like 565, which is after scaling by 2 to the 48, right? So these are vanishingly small numbers and prohibitively large numbers. But this is still a trading pair that users might want to trade with. And so we want to make sure that whatever strategy we employ to make the smart contract work is going to be permissive to these kinds of tokens. Even if this is an edge case, we still want to allow it. So, in terms of the 54-bit, limit, we're doing just fine on this side of the order. But here you can see the binary really running off the side of the screen here. So we're 28 bits over on this particular case. So let me show you how we do this. Usually what you would do if you're in a normal computer system is you would resort to something like IEEE floats. But on Ethereum, we have no such convenience. So we have to develop it ourselves. This is exactly that number, right, in binary. And what we do is we effectively just take the first 48 bits, right? And these are going to be the ones that we store in the smart contract. Everything else gets zeroed out. So we're, losing some information here, which is where the precision loss comes into it. And then we basically just count the number of zeros here, right? So if we're striking out 34 zeros of precision, then this becomes 2 to the 34. Remember, this is in binary. So after converting that back into decimal, you'll see that it's, that price can be represented this way, and this is actually what we're going to be encoding. Okay, and there's the 54 bits. So even with extremely challenging edge cases like the wrap Bitcoin Shiba Inu case, we actually do have an implementation that can handle, numbers that enormous. And so it's worth then asking, like, what is the range of prices that we can support? On the high side, for any two tokens after accounting for their differences in decimality, we can support price differences of about 2 to the 96 and down to about the inverse of that, which is, I think, a pretty good scale for cryptocurrency tokens. Now, usually for like most sane tokens, you might think, well, we'd probably never need anything like that. Bitcoin's 100K now, maybe one day it'll be a million. But just remember that the decimals matter. USDC is a 6 decimal token, ETH is an 18 decimal token. So it's already 12 orders of magnitude different compared to what you would expect. Okay, so that's looking at basically how the encoding and rounding issues occur here. And we're going to come back to it again in just a moment. But I want to now turn our attention to, excuse me. Yeah, okay. Let's have a look at how the rounding is actually affected here, because I actually glossed over some of the details in the sense that when we strike out all of those zeros, right, when we only took the first 48 significant bits and zeroed out the rest, that has consequences, right? So let's have a look at what those consequences are. If this is that specific range, the B value, which is one of the things that we were computing here, is going to be rounded down, all right? Or at least let's ask the question, what happens when we round it down? Because we're always dealing with reciprocal prices on the asking side, rounding down is going to have the opposite effect than rounding down on the bidding side. When we round down, effectively this border is going to move further down on the bids and further up on the asks. Now, I've massively exaggerated this because, we'd be looking at less than a pixel of difference if we were doing this on an actual data plot. But just know that we're moving the price in the direction that the taker wouldn't want it to move in, right? We're giving the maker a better price than the one that they were hoping for. Now, the A variable represents effectively the width between these two price bounds. And so when we round it down, we're also decreasing the width, which again moves the bidding prices further down and the asking prices further up. So we're always moving the prices in such a way that the maker is going to get a better deal than the one that they were trying to get in the first place. Okay. So coming back to the encoding here, if we're rounding down, we're basically losing everything after the decimal point. And just because of the nature of that, that's of course moving to a lower number. Then when we do the in-house compression, because we're losing information up here, this is always necessarily going to be a lower number than that one was. Right, so this act of rounding down is always going to be a more defensive programming strategy than moving it the other direction in all cases. And just as a general sort of note here, I think that it is important to recognize that while you're off-chain, you have relatively unlimited computer resources, and so anything that you can do to protect your system, including the processing heavy lifting, is best done via something like an SDK. And not on the contracts where it's already vulnerable. Okay, let's now have a look at the taker. And this is where things get kind of dangerous, because the taker always has an advantage against you in the sense that they get to choose when they're interacting. Couple of things to note. Overflow always occurs at 256 bits, and computers are really bad at division. The swap equations look like this, and we're going to be walking through them one by one. Again, you can refer to my previous lectures if you want to understand exactly where these things come from. But let's just have a look at these particular cases, and here's our taker over here. This is the contract data that they're going to be interacting with. And in this particular case, if they're using the trade by source swap function, they're going to be sending a certain amount of tokens into one of the other orders and then taking tokens from the other order. And here, the way that this equation is organized is basically telling you that this is written as a function of the amount that they're sending into the smart contract, meaning that they're asking the question, how much of this ETH can I get for the Delta X or USDC that I'm providing? Which means that we want to underestimate that amount, okay? We never want to round up and give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, you might think that that's, extortionist or, impolite or disrespectful, but remember this taker, we always assume that they're a member of the Lazarus group, right? You assume that this is someone working with the North Korean government or a similarly well-equipped terrorist organization who has enormous resources and is dedicated to exploiting your protocol. So when we have the option, we always give the taker a worse deal than the one that the pure theory would otherwise mandate. Yeah, so this is the summary of what I basically just said. The person who is actively performing an exchange at any time always has the advantage, and you have to assume that they are a hostile antagonist. Okay, so how do we process these equations? Notice that this one has exactly one division, so it's going to give you better accuracy in all circumstances. But it has some issues. The first one is that these numbers are up to 96 bits. Y and Z are up to 112 bits, and we're going to square this thing, right? It's very, very likely that this thing is going to overflow it to 156 bits. But if it doesn't overflow, we're actually going to get a very good, accurate calculation out of it. This one doesn't have the same memory burden in the numerator, or the denominator for that matter, but it's now performing a division twice. So this means that we're going to get a less accurate computation, but we can handle much larger numbers. So we can have both of these things. This is the full functional decomposition of just that trade by source, swap function. And I've got notes over here telling you about when results are constrained to 256 bits and when they're not. And I'm going to bring your attention to two things in particular. One is that, and it's hard to see on this screen, unfortunately, but we're controlling the direction of rounding at each step of this decomposition. So we're rounding, these are all ceiling divisions, I think in this case. And we're using moldiv when we can get away with it, which means that you can exceed the 256-bit constraint as long as it's a part of an intermediate calculation, which after division puts you back on 256 bits. This is the final decomposition of that. And so if you wanted to ignore everything I had on those slides, this one at the bottom is exactly what we've implemented and is kind of the fast shorthand for getting this computation to work. Now, remember, I said that in this case, we always want to round down, and you can see everything on the numerator has been floored and everything in the denominator has been ceiling to division. So the rounding is very carefully controlled. Okay, so that's trade by source. Let's talk about trade by target quickly. Again, we have two different ways of representing this, but in fact, we only need one of them. Now, here, we're asking the opposite question. Rather than the Lazarus group member now asking to send a certain amount of tokens to the contract, they're instead quoting the tokens they want to receive from the contract, and we're calculating how much they need to send in, right? So this is like a request for quote type of calculation. Again, same functional decomposition as before. And I'm going to bring your attention to, again, that we have the same ceiling divisions and floor divisions where necessary to control the rounding in the direction that we want. This one decomposes slightly more cleanly. And again, we only need one equation because luckily the algebra comes out here where we don't have necessarily the same 256-bit overflow in the numerator like we did before. And again, remember, for dx, we want to round this one up, which is why we have ceiling divisions on the numerator and over the fraction overall, while we're rounding down in the denominator to make dx the largest possible number within the tolerance that we're permitting on the contracts. Let's just recognize that this has been a pretty heavy talk. I understand that. And I've gone through all of this very quickly. if this is interesting to you, if you maybe have invested in an exchange and you're trying to interrogate whether or not they are taking their defensive mandates seriously, or if you're using an exchange and you would like to know if maybe that exchange is vulnerable, or if you're developing one. I have written this up in a blog. All of the details that I've provided here in this talk are there. And you can also just talk to me whenever you like. I'm very happy to answer questions about this all the time. The very last thing I'm bringing attention to, and don't worry, we're done with the math, is that this tick price boundary phenomenon in DeFi right now is a really dangerous one. What we're basically doing here is we're forcing a discrete grid on top of a dynamic system. And there's enormous potential for async. And that was used in both the exploits in September and more recently to cause these protocols to overflow or to return values that didn't make sense and has been exploited many, many times before. So this tick price thing, people mostly have accepted that this is just something that is intrinsic to DeFi protocols now. There's no way to do concentrated liquidity without it. That in everything that I've described to you today, right, there is no tick range here. This exchange is completely free of a discrete grid. It uses exclusively closed form continuous calculus. So all of those exploits that all of these attackers have been using for years are actually not applicable here simply because we do not have a discrete grid. So yeah, these are our approximations. They're well-defined, well-controlled, well-constrained. I'm very confident that this system is secure, and I'm very happy to talk about why I think it's secure. Yeah, that's the talk. I hope that you found this at least slightly informative.